Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of rural Kentucky, a story that lay buried beneath layers of silence, shame, and secrecy for 4 decades. I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration, because what you are about to hear is not just a story from the past. It is a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human nature, and it demands to be remembered by those who bear witness to it today. In the winter of 1884, in a remote corner of Harlan County, Kentucky, there stood a house that everyone in the valley knew, but no one truly understood. The Thornwell Estate, as it was called by the few who dared to speak of it, was a structure of considerable size for that time and place, a 2-story timber frame house with white clapboard siding that had long since turned gray from neglect and the relentless Appalachian weather. The house sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by dense forests of oak and pine, isolated from the nearest town by nearly 7 miles of treacherous mountain terrain. To reach it in those days required either a strong horse or stronger legs, and most people had neither the means nor the inclination to make the journey. The family who lived there was known by reputation more than by personal acquaintance. Nathaniel Thornwell, the patriarch, was a man of approximately 50 years, though his weathered face and stooped posture made him appear considerably older. He had come to Kentucky from Virginia in the years following the Civil War, carrying with him a modest inheritance and a wife named Catherine, a woman described by the few who remembered her as beautiful in a fragile porcelain way, with pale skin and dark hair that she wore in the fashion of an earlier era. They had arrived with 2 young daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, children who were rarely seen by neighbors, and whose existence was confirmed primarily through occasional glimpses during the family's infrequent trips to town for supplies.
The transformation of the Thornwell property from a modest but respectable homestead into something that resembled a decaying monument to isolation did not happen overnight, but rather through the slow accumulation of neglect that marks the passage of time in places where hope has been abandoned. By 1888, 4 years after our story truly begins, the house had taken on an almost Gothic quality in the minds of those who passed by it on the rare occasions when their travels took them down that particular stretch of mountain road. The windows, which had once presumably let light into the rooms within, were now perpetually shuttered or covered with heavy curtains that never seemed to open, giving the structure the appearance of a building that had closed its eyes against the world and decided never to open them again. Children in the valley, as children always do, wove elaborate tales about the house and its inhabitants. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures moving past the covered windows at night, pale shapes that drifted through the darkness like smoke. Others swore they had heard screams coming from the property, though when pressed for details, these accounts always became vague and unreliable, the product of overactive imaginations and the human tendency to embellish stories in the retelling. The adults dismissed these tales as the foolishness of youth, but even they could not entirely shake the unease that the Thornwell house inspired, the sense that something within its walls had gone fundamentally wrong in ways that decent people preferred not to contemplate too closely. It was in the autumn of 1889 that the first tangible evidence of tragedy emerged, though it would take years for anyone to understand its true significance. A traveling physician named Dr. Henry Morrison, who made circuits through the mountain communities, providing medical care to families too isolated or too poor to maintain regular access to doctors, had been summoned to the Thornwell house under circumstances that he would later describe as highly irregular. He had been approached in town by Nathaniel Thornwell, who had requested that the doctor make a house call to examine one of his daughters who had fallen ill with what Nathaniel described as a persistent fever and respiratory complaint.
The request itself was not unusual, but the manner in which Nathaniel made it was strange. He seemed agitated, almost desperate, and he offered to pay double the doctor's usual fee if he would agree to come that very day without delay. Dr. Morrison, who had been practicing medicine for nearly 20 years and had seen his share of medical emergencies in remote areas, agreed to make the journey. He arrived at the Thornwell house in the late afternoon, when the autumn sun was already beginning to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the property. Nathaniel met him at the door and led him directly to a small bedroom on the ground floor, a room that appeared to serve as both living space and sick room for the patient in question. There, lying on a narrow bed covered with threadbare blankets, was a young woman who Dr. Morrison estimated to be in her early 20s, though her gaunt appearance and the gray pallor of her skin made precise age determination difficult. The patient, whom Nathaniel identified as his daughter Elizabeth, was indeed suffering from a fever, but as Dr. Morrison conducted his examination, he became increasingly aware that fever was perhaps the least of this young woman's problems. She was severely malnourished, her ribs clearly visible beneath her nightgown, her arms thin to the point where the bones seemed to press against the skin with nothing substantial between them. Her breathing was labored and shallow, suggesting possible pneumonia or another serious respiratory infection. But what disturbed the doctor most was the look in her eyes, a look he would later struggle to describe in his notes. It was not the glazed confusion of high fever or the pain-clouded gaze of acute illness, but rather something closer to terror mixed with resignation, the expression of someone who had learned through bitter experience that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. Dr. Morrison treated the immediate symptoms as best he could with the limited resources available in that time and place. He administered quinine for the fever, recommended bed rest and nutritious broths to address the malnutrition, and left instructions for follow-up care that he suspected would never be properly implemented. As he prepared to leave, he asked Nathaniel about the young woman's medical history, how long she had been ill, what her diet consisted of, whether she had access to fresh air and exercise. Nathaniel's answers were evasive and contradictory, suggesting at various points that Elizabeth had always been delicate, that she had inherited her mother's weak constitution, that she preferred to remain indoors, that she ate adequately but simply did not gain weight. None of these explanations satisfied Dr. Morrison, but he was in a difficult position, bound by both the medical ethics of his time and the social conventions that limited his authority to intervene in family matters. Before departing, Dr. Morrison asked a question that had been forming in his mind since he had entered the house. He inquired about Catherine Thornwell and the other daughter Margaret, asking if they too required medical attention. Nathaniel's response was swift and firm. Catherine, he said, had passed away several years earlier from consumption, a claim that Dr. Morrison had no way to verify, but was certainly plausible given the prevalence of tuberculosis in that era. As for Margaret, Nathaniel assured him that she was in perfect health and was currently upstairs resting, having been up late the previous night caring for her sick sister. When Dr. Morrison suggested that he might examine Margaret as well, simply as a precaution given the infectious nature of some respiratory illnesses, Nathaniel's demeanor changed dramatically. He positioned himself between the doctor and the staircase, his body language making it abundantly clear that access to the upper floor was absolutely forbidden, and he informed Dr. Morrison in a tone that broke no argument that Margaret was sleeping and was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. The doctor left the Thornwell house that evening with a profound sense of unease that he could not entirely articulate or justify. He had treated the patient he had been called to see, he had been paid for his services, and he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing or abuse beyond a general impression that something in that house was deeply wrong. He considered reporting his concerns to Sheriff Whitaker, but what exactly would he report? That a young woman was malnourished and ill, conditions that were unfortunately common among the poor and isolated families of the mountains? That a father had refused to allow him access to another part of the house, which was certainly the father's right? That he had a feeling, nothing more substantial than an intuition based on years of medical practice, that the Thornwell family was harboring some terrible secret? In the end, Dr. Morrison did what many well-meaning people do when confronted with situations that trouble them, but which they feel powerless to change. He made a note in his medical journal about the case, he mentioned his concerns to a few trusted colleagues, and he told himself that he would monitor the situation and intervene if circumstances warranted it. But the mountains were vast, his responsibilities were many, and the Thornwell family faintly fended from Eve attention, becoming just another file in the mental archive of troubling cases that physicians accumulate over the course of their careers, cases that haunt them in quiet moments, but which the demands of daily practice eventually push aside. Elizabeth Thornwell died 3 weeks after Dr. Morrison's visit. Her death was reported to the county registrar by Nathaniel himself, who made the journey to town to record the death and arrange for a burial permit. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia complicated by general decline, a diagnosis that was accepted without question or investigation. Dr. Morrison, when he learned of the death, felt a stab of guilt and regret, wondering if he should have done more, if there had been some intervention that might have saved her. But he also knew the realities of medical practice in that time and place. Many young people died of respiratory infections. Many families in the mountains lived in conditions that promote illness and prevent recovery. One more death, however tragic, was not sufficient to overcome the social and legal barriers that protected the privacy of the family.
The burial took place in a small family plot on the Thornwell property, a fact that some people found unusual, but was not unprecedented in rural areas where travel to established cemeteries was difficult, and family burial grounds were common. Nathaniel conducted the service himself, with no minister present and no mourners aside from, he claimed, his surviving daughter Margaret, who remained unseen by anyone outside the family. The grave was marked with a simple wooden cross that bore Elizabeth's name and the names of her birth and dates of her birth, the only physical evidence that she had ever existed at all. In the months following Elizabeth's death, the Thornwell house seemed to withdraw even further into itself, if such a thing were possible. Nathaniel's trips to town became less frequent, sometimes months passing between his appearances at the general store. When he did come to town, people noticed that he had aged dramatically, his hair now completely white, his movements slow and labored, as if each step required an effort of will. He spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary, conducting his business as quickly as possible and departing with the small courtesies and pleasantries that normally characterized even brief social interactions in small communities. And still, no one was allowed upstairs. The few people who had occasion to enter the Thornwell house in those years, tradesmen or county officials conducting periodic business, all reported the same experience. Nathaniel would meet them at the door, conduct whatever business required their presence in the ground floor rooms, and make it absolutely clear through both word and deed that the staircase leading to the second floor was a boundary that would not be crossed. Some speculated that the upper floor had fallen into such disrepair that Nathaniel was embarrassed to let anyone see it. Others suggested that he had moved all his living quarters to the ground floor to avoid the effort of climbing stairs as he aged. A few whispered darker theories, but without evidence these remained only whispers, easily dismissed by those who preferred to believe that their suspicions were the product of overactive imaginations, rather than accurate intuitions about genuine horror.
The winter of 1892 brought with it a severity that the old-timers claimed they had not seen in decades. A relentless cold that seemed to seep into bones and buildings alike, freezing everything it touched with an impartiality that made no distinction between the prepared and the unprepared, the wealthy and the poor, the righteous and the wicked. Snow fell in quantities that made travel nearly impossible for weeks at a time, and the wind that howled down from the higher elevations carried with it a bitter edge that found every crack and gap in even the most carefully constructed structures. It was a winter that tested the limits of human endurance and the adequacy of human preparation, and for many families in the mountains, it was a winter that would be remembered for the rest of their lives as the season when survival itself became the only goal that mattered. For Nathaniel Thornwell, isolated in his deteriorating house at the end of that lonely mountain road, the winter of 1892 became something more than a test of endurance. It became the beginning of the end, though he could not have known this as he struggled to maintain heat in the few rooms he still occupied, as he rationed the supplies he had laid in before the worst of the weather arrived, as he climbed those forbidden stairs each day to deliver food and water to whatever or whoever remained in the rooms above. The strain of that winter, combined with his advancing age and the psychological burden of whatever secrets he carried, took a visible toll on his health. By the time spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt, revealing the brown and muddy landscape beneath, Nathaniel Thornwell had become a shadow of even the diminished figure he had been the previous autumn. It was in early April of 1893 that Samuel Fletcher, a farmer whose property bordered the Thornwell land on its eastern edge, noticed that he had not seen any smoke rising from the Thornwell chimney for several days, an observation that concerned him because even in spring, the mountain nights were cold enough to require a fire. Fletcher was not a particularly close neighbor, the distance between their houses being more than a mile of rough terrain, and his relationship with Nathaniel had never progressed beyond the occasional distant wave when they happened to see each other working their respective properties. But the absence of smoke from a chimney in early spring was the kind of sign that mountain people learned to watch for, an indicator that something might be wrong, that someone might need help, that the obligations of basic human decency required at least a minimal effort to investigate. Fletcher made the journey to the Thornwell house on foot, picking his way along the muddy road that was still half frozen in the shaded areas and churned into deep ruts where the sun had been able to reach it. As he approached the property, he was struck by how completely silent everything was. No sound of human activity, no barking of a dog, no clucking of chickens,
Nothing but the wind moving through the bare branches of the trees and the occasional call of a crow. The house itself looked even more dilapidated than he remembered from the last time he had seen it, which had been months earlier, the winter having added new damage to the existing neglect. Shingles blown away from the roof, shutters hanging at odd angles, the whole structure taking on the appearance of something that was in the process of returning to the earth from which its materials had been taken. Fletcher knocked on the front door and received no response. He knocked again, louder this time, calling out Nathaniel's name, identifying himself, explaining that he was there because he was concerned about the lack of smoke from the chimney. Still no response. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which was not particularly unusual in that time and place, where locked doors were less common than they would later become, but which nonetheless added to his sense that something was wrong. He pushed the door open and called out again, announcing his presence, giving anyone inside the opportunity to respond or to ask him to leave if his presence was unwanted. The interior of the house was cold and dark, the air stale and heavy with smells that Fletcher could not immediately identify, but which suggested decay and long-term neglect. He found Nathaniel in what appeared to be a small parlor just off the main hallway, sitting in a chair positioned near a fireplace that contained only cold ashes. At first, Fletcher thought the old man was merely sleeping, but as he approached and spoke Nathaniel's name, he realized with a start that Nathaniel Thornwell was dead, had been dead for perhaps several days, based on the coldness of the body and the settled quality of the corpse. The cause of death was not immediately apparent, no visible wounds or signs of violence, just an old man who had apparently died sitting in his chair, possibly from heart failure or stroke, or simply from the accumulated burdens of age and whatever life he had lived. Fletcher, who had never before discovered a dead body, stood in that cold parlor for several long moments, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing and to determine what he should do next. His first thought was that he needed to notify the authorities, to report the death so that proper procedures could be followed. His second thought, following almost immediately after the first, was a question that had probably been forming in his subconscious since the moment he had entered the house. If Nathaniel was dead, and if there was indeed a daughter named Margaret who was supposed to be living in this house, where was she? Was she upstairs? Was she also dead? Or had she left, perhaps going for help when her father had fallen ill, though that seemed unlikely given how isolated the property was and how difficult travel would have been during the winter months. The staircase loomed before him as he stood in the hallway, that forbidden passage that had been the subject of so much speculation over the years. Fletcher was not a man particularly given to superstition or wild imagination, but standing in that silent house with a corpse in the next room, he felt a genuine reluctance to climb those stairs, a sense that doing so would take him across some threshold into knowledge that could not be unknowledged, into truths that once learned could never be unlearned. But he also felt the weight of responsibility, the understanding that if someone was upstairs, if Margaret Thornwell was alive and possibly in need of help, then he could not simply turn away and pretend he had not thought of the possibility. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight in the silence of the abandoned house. The staircase rose steeply, turning once at a small landing before continuing to the second floor. At the top, he found himself in a narrow hallway with 4 closed doors, 2 on each side. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the weak daylight that filtered up from the ground floor, and the air here was even more stale than below, thick with a mustiness that suggested these spaces had not been properly ventilated in years. Fletcher stood at the top of those stairs, facing those closed doors, and felt his courage beginning to fail him. He called out, asking if anyone was there, explaining that Nathaniel was dead and that he was there to help if help was needed. The silence that answered him was absolute and profound. He opened the first door and found what appeared to have once been a bedroom, but which was now empty of furniture except for a broken bed frame and a water-stained mattress that lay directly on the floor. The room smelled of mildew and rot, and the wallpaper hung in long strips where moisture had loosened its adhesive. He moved to the second door and found a similar scene, another bedroom reduced to abandonment and decay, nothing in it to suggest recent habitation or to explain why access to this floor had been so jealously guarded for so many years. The third door revealed a small storage room filled with old trunks and boxes, their contents spilling out where mice and time had destroyed their integrity, old clothes and papers and household items that no one had used or needed in decades. It was the fourth door, the last door, at the far end of the hallway, that was different. This door was not simply closed but secured, a heavy iron bolt installed on the outside, clearly a recent addition given its lack of rust and the fresh marks in the wood where it had been attached. Fletcher stood before this door, his hand on the bolt, and felt a fear that was both rational and instinctive, the fear of opening a door that someone had clearly gone to great lengths to ensure remained closed. But he had come this far, had climbed the forbidden stairs, had searched the other rooms, and to turn back now without knowing what lay behind this final door seemed impossible, a failure of both curiosity and duty that he would regret for the rest of his life. He slid the bolt back, the metal making a harsh scraping sound in the silence, and pushed the door open.
The room that lay beyond that bolted door was unlike anything Samuel Fletcher had expected to find, though what exactly he had expected he could not have said even to himself. It was a bedroom, or at least it had been designed and furnished as such, though the word bedroom seemed inadequate to describe what it had become over the years of its occupation. The space was perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet, with a single window that had been boarded over from the inside, the boards nailed so securely that not even the smallest sliver of natural light could penetrate them. The only illumination came from the doorway where Fletcher stood, and from a single oil lamp that sat on a small table near the bed, its fuel long since exhausted, the wick burned down to nothing. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, Fletcher began to distinguish details that would remain burned into his memory for the remainder of his days. There was a narrow bed pushed against one wall, made up with blankets that had once been of good quality, but which were now worn thin and stained. Next to the bed sat a chamber pot, a water pitcher, and a wash basin, the basic necessities of a room meant for long-term occupation. Along another wall stood a small bookshelf containing perhaps 24 volumes, their spines faded and worn from repeated reading. A simple wooden chair sat beside the boarded window, positioned as if someone had habitually sat there, despite having no view to look out upon, perhaps simply facing the direction where a window had once offered connection to the outside world. But it was not the furnishings that caused Fletcher's breath to catch in his throat, and his heart to begin racing with a mixture of horror and profound pity. It was the woman who sat in that chair by the boarded window, so still and silent that at first he thought she too must be dead, another victim of whatever tragedy had consumed this household. She was dressed in a faded nightgown that hung loosely on a frame so thin that she appeared almost skeletal, her hair long and completely white, despite the fact that she could not have been more than 30 years old based on what Fletcher knew of the Thornwell family history. Her skin had the pale, almost translucent quality of someone who had not seen sunlight in years, and her hands, folded in her lap, were delicate as bird bones, the knuckles prominent and the veins visible beneath the papery skin. Fletcher spoke her name, or what he assumed must be her name, asking softly if she was Margaret Thornwell, explaining that he was a neighbor and that her father had died and that he was here to help her. The woman gave no indication that she had heard him, no movement of her head, no change in her expression, no acknowledgement of his presence whatsoever. She simply continued to sit in that chair, staring at the boarded-over window as if she could see through the wooden planks to some vista beyond, her eyes unfocused and distant in a way that suggested she was not truly present in the room despite her physical presence there. Fletcher took a cautious step into the room, still speaking in that same soft tone, trying to reassure this woman that he meant no harm, that he was there to help, that she was safe now and could leave this room if she wished. As he moved closer, he noticed details that made the true horror of the situation begin to reveal itself. The doorframe showed deep scratches on the inside, marks that could only have been made by fingernails clawing desperately at the wood, the scratches layered one upon another in a pattern that suggests years of such attempts. The walls near the door bore similar marks, and in some places the wallpaper had been torn away entirely, revealing the bare plaster beneath. Near the bed he could see what appears to be a makeshift calendar scratched into the wall, hundreds of small marks grouped in sets of 7, a prisoner's method of tracking time when no other means was available. The woman in the chair finally moved, a slight turning of her head in Fletcher's direction, though her eyes did not quite focus on him, but rather seemed to look through him or past him to something only she could see. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from long disuse, the words coming slowly as if she had to remember how to form them. She asked in that whisper if it was time for her meal, if he had brought her food, if her father would be coming later to check on her. The questions were delivered without emotion, without hope or fear or any of the feelings that one would expect from someone in such a situation.
just a flat recitation of the routine that had apparently defined her existence for however many years she had been confined to this room. Fletcher felt tears burning in his eyes as the full weight of what he was witnessing settled upon him. This woman, whoever she truly was, had been kept in this room like an animal in a cage, fed and maintained at some minimal level, but denied every freedom and dignity that human beings are supposed to possess. The isolation must have been absolute. No conversation beyond whatever brief exchanges occurred when food was delivered, no companionship, no stimulation beyond the limited contents of this small room, nothing but day after day of sitting in that chair or lying in that bed, watching the marks on the wall accumulate, feeling her youth and vitality slowly drain away in the darkness. How long had she been here? Since her mother's disappearance? Since Elizabeth's death? Since some earlier point that predated even the family's arrival in Kentucky? There was no way to know without asking questions that Fletcher suspected this woman was in no condition to answer. He approached her slowly, extending his hand in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture, telling her that she could leave now, that her father was dead and could no longer keep her here, that he would take her to town where people could help her and care for her properly. But his words seemed to bounce off her without effect, as if she literally could not comprehend what he was saying, as if the concepts of leaving and freedom and help were so foreign to her experience that they held no meaning. She continued to sit in that chair, occasionally moving her head slightly, sometimes murmuring words that Fletcher could not quite make out, her mind clearly damaged by the years of imprisonment in ways that would never fully heal. Fletcher realized that he needed help, that this situation was far beyond anything he was equipped to handle on his own. He needed to get the sheriff, a doctor, probably other officials who had the authority and resources to deal with such a case. But he was reluctant to leave this woman alone, fearful that in his absence she might harm herself, or that she might somehow disappear, vanishing back into the shadows and the silence that had hidden her for so long. He compromised by making her as comfortable as she could in the immediate moment, bringing her water from the pitcher on the bedside table, ensuring that she was warm enough, speaking to her in soothing tones, even though she showed little sign of understanding or responding to his words. Then he descended those stairs as quickly as his shaking legs would carry him, left the house, and began the journey back to his own property, where he could saddle a horse and ride to town to report what he had found. The journey seemed to take forever, though in reality it was only a few hours, his mind reeling with the images of what he had seen, trying to construct some narrative that would make sense of it, some explanation that would fit the facts into a framework that his understanding of human nature and human behavior could accommodate. But no explanation came, nothing that satisfied the questions that crowded his thoughts. Why had Nathaniel Thornwell imprisoned his own daughter? What had she done, or what had he believed she had done, that justified such treatment? Or was there no justification at all, just the actions of a man whose mind had become as twisted and dark as the house in which he had lived? Sheriff Thomas Whitaker, the same man who had dismissed Eleanor Bradshaw's concerns more than a decade earlier, listened to Fletcher's account with an expression that shifted from skepticism to horror as the details accumulated. He immediately assembled a small group of men, including Dr. Morrison, who still practiced in the area despite his advancing years, and a county magistrate named Robert Hammond, who would need to be involved in any official proceedings that might follow. They made the journey to the Thornwell house as a group, arriving in the late afternoon, the spring sun casting long shadows across the property that looked somehow more sinister now that its secrets were beginning to be revealed. Dr. Morrison examined Nathaniel's body first, confirming what Fletcher had already known, that the old man had been dead for at least 3 days, possibly longer, the cause of death most likely heart failure, brought on by age and the accumulated stresses of his life. Then they climbed those stairs together, these men who represented the limited authority and resources of their community, and they entered that bolted room where Margaret Thornwell, if that was indeed who she was, still sat in her chair by the boarded window, apparently unchanged from the position in which Fletcher had found her hours earlier.
Dr. Morrison's examination of the woman who had been locked away in that room for so many years was conducted with a gentleness that spoke to his decades of medical practice and his understanding that this patient required not just physical assessment, but the kind of careful, respectful approach that one would use with a wild animal that had been trapped and injured. He spoke to her in soft, measured tones throughout the examination, explaining each thing he was going to do before he did it, asking permission even though she seemed incapable of granting or denying it in any meaningful way, treating her with a dignity that the circumstances of her captivity had denied her for what appeared to be the better part of her adult life. The physical findings were deeply troubling. The woman was severely malnourished, her weight dangerously low for someone of her height and frame,
her muscles atrophied from years of limited movement within the confines of the small room. Her skin showed evidence of vitamin deficiencies, with areas of unusual dryness and discoloration that suggested a diet lacking in essential nutrients. Her teeth, which Dr. Morrison examined as part of his assessment, were in poor condition, showing signs of decay and neglect that would have been painful, and which certainly contributed to her difficulty eating whatever food had been provided to her. Her hair, that striking white that seemed so incongruous with her relatively young age, was a phenomenon that Dr. Morrison had read about in medical literature, but had never personally witnessed, a condition sometimes called Marie Antoinette syndrome, though the scientific validity of that designation was disputed, in which severe psychological trauma could cause rapid graying or whitening of the hair. But it was the psychological damage that concerned Dr. Morrison most deeply, and which he knew himself least equipped to address given the primitive state of mental health understanding and treatment in that era. The woman exhibited what he would later describe in his report as a profound dissociative state, seeming to exist in a reality of her own construction that bore little relationship to the actual circumstances around her. She responded to questions only sporadically and with answers that often made no logical sense, referring to events and people that might have been real or might have been products of her damaged mind's attempt to populate the emptiness of her captivity with some form of company or narrative structure. She showed no emotional response to being told that her father was dead, no relief or grief or any of the complex feelings that such news should have provoked, suggesting that her capacity for normal emotional responses had been so severely damaged that she could no longer access it in any meaningful way. Sheriff Whitaker, standing at the doorway of that room and observing Dr. Morrison's examination, felt the full weight of his earlier failure settling upon his shoulders like a physical burden. He remembered Eleanor Bradshaw coming to him all those years ago with her concerns about the Thornwell family, and he remembered how he had dismissed those concerns as the overactive worry of a meddlesome schoolteacher who did not understand the limits of his authority or the proper boundaries between public interest and private family matters. If he had investigated then, if he had pressed harder, if he had found some legal mechanism to force entry into this house and examine its secrets, could this tragedy have been prevented? Could Elizabeth Thornwell, whose grave lay somewhere on this property, have been saved? Could Catherine Thornwell, whose disappearance had never been adequately explained, have been protected? Could this woman sitting before him now have been freed years earlier, before the damage to her mind and body had become so profound and possibly irreversible? These were questions that Whitaker would ask himself for the rest of his life, questions that would color his approach to his duties as sheriff and his understanding of the balance between respecting individual privacy and protecting vulnerable members of the community. But in that moment, standing in that terrible room, he forced himself to focus on the practical matters that required immediate attention. The woman needed to be removed from this house and taken somewhere she could receive proper care. Nathaniel's body needed to be removed and prepared for burial. The house itself needed to be thoroughly searched to determine if there were other victims, other secrets hidden within its walls or buried on its grounds. And most importantly, they needed to try to understand what had happened here, to piece together a timeline of events that would explain how a seemingly ordinary family had descended into such darkness and horror. The removal of Margaret Thornwell from the house proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. She resisted leaving the room with a panic that was the first strong emotion she had displayed since Fletcher had discovered her. When they tried to guide her toward the door, she began to shake violently, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow, her eyes wide with a terror that suggested leaving the room was somehow more frightening to her than remaining in it. Dr. Morrison theorized that the room had become her entire world, the only environment in which she felt some measure of safety or predictability, and that the prospect of venturing beyond it into unknown spaces triggered a fear response that overwhelmed even her desire for freedom, assuming she still possessed such a desire after so many years of captivity. The first burial site was located in a wooded area approximately 50 yards behind the house, in a clearing that was partially hidden by overgrown brush and young trees that had taken root in the years since the ground had been disturbed. The grave was shallow, perhaps 3 feet deep, and the remains it contained were badly deteriorated, reduced to bones and fragments of clothing that had somehow survived the passage of time and the actions of soil and insects. Dr. Morrison, who had some experience with forensic matters, though such expertise was far less developed in that era than it would later become, examined the remains as carefully as the conditions allowed and determined that they belonged to an adult female who had been buried sometime between 10 and 15 years earlier, a timeline that aligned perfectly with Catherine Thornwell's disappearance. The cause of death could not be definitively determined due to the state of decomposition, but Dr. Morrison noted certain irregularities in the skeletal structure that suggested the possibility of violent trauma. Several ribs showed evidence of old fractures that had healed poorly, and there were marks on some of the bones that could have been caused by a blade or other sharp implement, though he cautioned that such marks could also have been caused by post-mortem damage from roots or animals. What was clear beyond any reasonable doubt was that Catherine Thornwell had not died of consumption as Nathaniel had claimed, had not returned to Virginia to care for relatives, and had not simply chosen to abandon her family. She had been killed, almost certainly by Nathaniel himself, and buried in an unmarked grave where she would have remained forever if not for the chain of events that had finally brought investigators to the property. The second burial site was found near the small family cemetery where Elizabeth Thornwell's marked grave was located. The discovery came about when one of the searchers noticed that the ground near Elizabeth's grave appeared to have been disturbed more recently than that grave's known date, as if something else had been buried there around the same time or shortly thereafter. Careful excavation revealed another set of remains, these ones much fresher than Catherine's, buried at a depth that suggested a hasty interment conducted by someone whose strength was failing. The remains were those of a young woman, and while positive identification would require more extensive examination, the circumstances and location left little doubt that these were the actual remains of Elizabeth Thornwell, buried here after she had died in that ground-floor bedroom where Dr. Morrison had examined her. But the journals suggested something even more disturbing than the simple fact of these two deaths. As Nathaniel's writings progressed through the years following Catherine's murder, they revealed a man whose grip on reality had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer distinguish between his religious delusions and objective truth. He wrote about Margaret and Elizabeth with an obsessive focus that went far beyond normal paternal concern, describing elaborate fantasies about spiritual warfare in which his daughters were simultaneously precious innocents who needed protection and potential vessels for demonic corruption that required constant vigilance. He wrote about isolating them from the outside world, about keeping them pure and untainted by removing them from any contact with society, about the necessity of controlling every aspect of their lives to ensure their salvation. The entries following Elizabeth's death were particularly revealing about what had happened to Margaret. Nathaniel wrote that Elizabeth's illness and death had been a test from God, a demonstration of what happened when his guard slipped and worldly influences were allowed to touch his family. Dr. Morrison's visit, which Nathaniel interpreted as an intrusion by forces that wished to corrupt and destroy his household, seemed to have triggered a complete psychological break. In the weeks after Elizabeth's death, Nathaniel became convinced that Margaret herself was in grave spiritual danger, that she had been contaminated by her sister's illness and death, that she needed to be completely isolated and purified through prayer and fasting, and removal from all temptation and worldly contact. The entry describing his decision to lock Margaret in the upstairs room was written in a tone of absolute conviction and righteousness. He described it not as imprisonment but as salvation, not as cruelty but as the highest form of love, a father's willingness to take extreme measures to save his daughter's eternal soul, even if it meant sacrificing her earthly happiness and freedom. He wrote about installing the bolt on the outside of the door, about boarding up the window to prevent her from being corrupted by views of the outside world, about establishing a routine of daily food delivery and waste removal that would sustain her physical body, while allowing her spirit to be purified through isolation and prayer. He seemed completely unable to recognize the monstrousness of what he was doing, convinced instead that he was performing a holy duty that would ultimately be vindicated by God. The later journal entries became increasingly disturbed and difficult to read, not just because of their content but because Nathaniel's handwriting had deteriorated to the point where individual words were sometimes illegible. He wrote about conversations he claimed to have with Margaret through the bolted door, conversations in which she supposedly thanked him for protecting her, and expressed her understanding that the isolation was necessary for her spiritual welfare. Given what the rescuers had found when they finally opened that door, these conversations had almost certainly been either fabrications of Nathaniel's delusional mind, or grotesquely distorted interpretations of whatever limited communication actually occurred between father and imprisoned daughter. The final entries in the journals, written in the weeks before Nathaniel's death, showed a man who seemed to be experiencing occasional moments of clarity when he glimpsed the true horror of what he had done, moments that were immediately buried under layers of religious justification and paranoid rationalization. He wrote about feeling tired,
about knowing that his strength was failing, about worrying what would happen to Margaret when he was no longer able to care for her. But even in these moments of apparent concern, he never once considered the obvious solution of simply unlocking the door and setting her free. His mind, warped by years of delusion and isolation, could not conceive of any reality in which Margaret existed outside that locked room, could not imagine any future for her other than continued imprisonment under his control. The journals were eventually entered into evidence in the legal proceedings that followed, though the question of what crimes had actually been committed, and who could be held accountable for them, presented significant challenges for the legal system of that era. Nathaniel himself was beyond the reach of earthly justice, having died before his actions came to light. There was no question that he had murdered Catherine, and strong evidence suggested that his treatment of Elizabeth had contributed to her death, and absolutely certain proof that he had imprisoned Margaret under conditions that constituted severe abuse and deprivation. But with the perpetrator dead, the legal system could do little more than document these crimes for the historical record, and attempt to provide some measure of justice and support for the surviving victim. Margaret Thornwell's recovery, to the extent that recovery was possible for someone who had endured what she had endured, became the focus of significant attention in the weeks and months following her rescue. Dr. Morrison devoted considerable time and effort to her care, treating her physical ailments with the limited medical tools available to him, and attempting to provide some form of psychological support, though the field of mental health treatment was still in its infancy and offered few effective interventions for trauma of this magnitude. Margaret remained in his care for several months, slowly regaining some physical strength as her nutrition improved and her body began to heal from years of deprivation. But the psychological damage proved far more resistant to treatment. Margaret continued to exist in a mental state that seemed to shift unpredictably between the present reality and whatever internal world she had constructed during her years of imprisonment. She had difficulty forming coherent sentences beyond simple phrases, struggled to understand or follow even basic social interactions, and showed signs of what would later be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though that diagnostic category would not be formally developed for many decades. She had panic attacks when placed in rooms with windows that were not covered, suggesting that years in the dark had made normal light exposure overwhelming to her sensory system. She had difficulty eating in the presence of others, having become accustomed to eating alone in her cell. She showed no interest in or understanding of the normal activities and concerns that occupied other women of her age and social class. The question of what should happen to Margaret in the long term presented a significant challenge for the community. She had no other family, no relatives who could be located to take responsibility for her care. She was clearly incapable of living independently or supporting herself through work. The options available in that era for people in her situation were extremely limited, and generally consisted of either long-term institutionalization in facilities that were often little better than warehouses for the mentally ill, or placement in some form of private care arrangement if resources could be found to support it.
The resolution to Margaret Thornwell's situation came from an unexpected source, a woman named Abigail Hendricks, who operated a small boarding house in the town, and who had followed the case with a combination of horror and deep compassion that eventually moved her to action. Mrs. Hendricks was a widow to offer Margaret a home. She approached Dr. Morrison with a proposal that Margaret come to live with her, that she would provide room and board and whatever care Margaret required, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing that this damaged woman would not be sent to one of the terrible institutions that passed for mental hospitals in that era. Dr. Morrison, who had been growing increasingly concerned about Margaret's future as the months passed and no other solutions presented themselves, accepted Mrs. Hendricks's offer with profound relief and gratitude. The arrangement proved as successful as could be hoped given the circumstances. Margaret moved into a small room in Mrs. Hendricks's boarding house, a space that Mrs. Hendricks had carefully prepared to be as non-threatening as possible, with soft lighting and familiar furnishings, and none of the stark emptiness that might remind Margaret of her years of imprisonment. Mrs. Hendricks proved to have a natural gift for caring for damaged souls, an infinite patience with Margaret's limitations and setbacks, and a willingness to accept Margaret exactly as she was, rather than constantly pushing her to become something she could never be. Over time, Margaret achieved a kind of stability that, while far from normal functioning, at least allowed her to exist with some measure of peace and comfort. She learned to tolerate the presence of other people for limited periods, though she never became truly comfortable in social situations and continued to prefer solitude. She developed simple routines that gave her days structure and predictability, helping with minor household tasks under Mrs. Hendricks's gentle supervision, taking short walks in the garden behind the boarding house, sitting in the parlor in the evenings while Mrs. Hendricks read aloud from books or newspapers. She never regained the ability to speak in complex sentences or to engage in anything resembling normal conversation, but she learned to communicate her basic needs and feelings through simple words and gestures that Mrs. Hendricks became expert at interpreting.
What Margaret never regained, what seemed to have been permanently destroyed by her years of isolation, was any real connection to her own past, or any clear sense of her own identity beyond the most basic level. She could not or would not answer questions about her life before the imprisonment, could not provide details about her mother or sister beyond vague acknowledgments that they had existed, could not explain what had happened during those terrible years, or what thoughts had sustained her through that darkness. Whether this was due to actual memory loss caused by trauma, or a psychological defense mechanism that protected her from having to consciously remember and process experiences too painful to bear, no one could say with certainty. Dr. Morrison suspected it was probably some combination of both, the mind's way of creating distance from unbearable reality. The Thornwell house itself became the subject of considerable debate in the community. Some argued that it should be burned to the ground, that no structure that had witnessed such horrors should be allowed to continue standing, that its very existence was a stain on the community and a reminder of evils that were better forgotten. Others pointed out that the house was property with monetary value, that it should be sold and the proceeds used to support Margaret's ongoing care and compensate, however inadequately, for what she had suffered. Still others suggested that it should be preserved as a kind of memorial or warning, a place where future generations could learn about what had happened and resolve never to let such things occur again. In the end, practical considerations won out over symbolic ones. The house was put up for auction by the county, which had assumed control of Nathaniel's estate in the absence of any other legal heirs. The sale attracted no bidders from the local community, as no one wanted to live in a house with such a dark history. But eventually a buyer was found from outside the area, someone who either did not know the full story or who believed that enough time and effort could transform the property into something that did not carry the weight of its past. The buyer tore down most of the original structure and rebuilt extensively, and over the following decades the property changed hands several times, each new owner adding their own modifications, until almost nothing remained of the original Thornwell house, except the foundation and a few structural timbers that had been too sound to justify replacing. The bodies of Catherine and Elizabeth Thornwell were given proper Christian burials in the town cemetery, their graves marked with headstones that recorded their names and dates, but made no mention of the circumstances of their deaths. The decision to bury them together, side by side in a plot purchased with funds raised by community subscription, was intended to provide them in death with the dignity and recognition they had been denied in life. A small service was held, attended by many people from the community who had never known these women in life, but who felt compelled to bear witness to their deaths, to acknowledge that their lives had mattered, even though those lives had been cut short by violence and tragedy. Nathaniel's body, by contrast, was buried in an unmarked grave in a corner of the town cemetery reserved for paupers and those whose families either could not afford proper burials or chose not to provide them. There was considerable sentiment in the community that his body should be buried somewhere else entirely, preferably outside the town limits, that he did not deserve to rest in the same ground as the women he had murdered and abused. But legal and practical considerations made such exclusion difficult, and in the end, the compromise of an unmarked grave in an isolated corner seemed to satisfy most people's desire to deny him the respect and remembrance that marked graves typically conveyed. The legal and medical communities took considerable interest in the Thornwell case as details of it spread beyond the immediate area. Dr. Morrison was invited to present the case at a regional medical conference, where he described Margaret's condition and the challenges of treating someone who had endured such prolonged isolation and abuse. His presentation sparked discussions about the psychological effects of isolation, about the nature of trauma and how it manifested in different individuals, about the ethical responsibilities of medical professionals to investigate situations that appear abnormal, even when they had no clear legal authority to do so. Some of the doctors who heard his presentation were skeptical that isolation alone could cause such severe and lasting psychological damage, a skepticism that reflected the limited understanding of mental health that prevailed in that era. But others recognized in Margaret's case confirmation of theories they had been developing about the fundamental human need for social connection and the devastating effects of prolonged deprivation of that connection. Sheriff Whitaker, for his part, used the Thornwell case as a catalyst for changes in how his office approached reports of domestic situations that might involve abuse or neglect. He could not change the legal framework that limited his authority to intervene in private family matters, but he could and did make it known that his office would take such reports more seriously, would investigate more thoroughly, and would look for creative ways to ensure the safety of vulnerable individuals, even when traditional legal mechanisms were inadequate. He also began advocating for changes to state laws that would give law enforcement and social services more authority to investigate situations where children or dependent adults might be at risk, though such changes would come slowly and incompletely,
with many setbacks and gaps that would allow future tragedies to occur. Eleanor Bradshaw, the schoolteacher who had first raised concerns about the Thornwell family so many years earlier, experienced the case as both a vindication and a source of profound regret. She had been right to be concerned, right to suspect that something was terribly wrong in that isolated house at the end of the mountain road. But her vindication came far too late to help the women who had suffered and died there. She threw herself into her teaching with renewed intensity, determined to ensure that the children in her care learned not just academic subjects, but also the importance of speaking up when they witness injustice, of trusting their instincts when situations seemed wrong, of understanding that silence in the face of abuse made one complicit in that abuse. Her students would later remember her as a fierce and passionate teacher who demanded much of them, but who also gave them tools for engaging with the world as moral actors rather than passive observers. Margaret Thornwell lived for another 14 years in Mrs. Hendricks's care, dying in 1907 at the approximate age of 47 from pneumonia that her weakened constitution could not fight off. Mrs. Hendricks was with her at the end, holding her hand and speaking softly to her as her breathing became increasingly labored and finally stopped. Margaret was buried next to her mother and sister in the town cemetery. The three Thornwell women finally reunited in death, if not in life, their shared headstone reading simply, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Margaret Thornwell, beloved of God, rest in peace. The choice to describe them as beloved of God was Mrs. Hendricks's, her way of asserting that whatever failures of human compassion and protection they had experienced in life, they were not forgotten or abandoned by the divine presence that she believed watched over all suffering souls.
The reverberations of the Thornwell case extended far beyond the immediate participants and the small Kentucky community where the events had unfolded. In the years following the discovery of what had happened in that house, the case became a subject of discussion and analysis in medical journals, legal publications, and even some early works of sociology that were attempting to understand the dynamics of family violence and the social structures that allowed such violence to remain hidden. The case was cited in arguments for expanded authority for child welfare agencies, for mandatory reporting requirements that would compel professionals like teachers and doctors to report suspected abuse, for laws that would make it easier to investigate situations where vulnerable individuals might be at risk, even in the absence of direct complaints from victims. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Thornwell case was the way it forced a broader reckoning with the question of privacy versus protection, a question that remains contested and unresolved even in our own time. The principle that a man's home is his castle, that what happens within the private sphere of the family is not the business of the state or the community, is deeply embedded in Anglo-American legal and cultural traditions. This principle serves important functions, protecting individuals from governmental overreach and preserving zones of autonomy where people can live according to their own values and make their own choices without constant surveillance and intervention. But the Thornwell case demonstrated with brutal clarity that this principle could also create sanctuaries for abuse, spaces where the vulnerable could be exploited and tormented with little fear of discovery or consequences. The challenge then, and now, is to find a balance between these competing values, to create systems that protect the vulnerable without creating a surveillance state that monitors and regulates every aspect of private life. The Thornwell case suggested that existing systems had tilted too far in the direction of non-intervention, that the principle of family privacy had been taken to such an extreme that it effectively nullified any meaningful protection for those who lacked the power or ability to protect themselves. But the corrective measures that some reformers proposed in response to the case raised their own concerns about governmental overreach and the potential for abuse of expanded state power, concerns that were not entirely without merit, given the history of how such power had been used to persecute religious minorities, break up immigrant families, and enforce conformity to dominant cultural norms. The medical community's engagement with the Thornwell case focused particularly on the question of what would later be called Stockholm Syndrome, though that term would not be coined until nearly a century after Margaret's rescue. Dr. Morrison and other physicians who studied the case were puzzled and disturbed by Margaret's apparent attachment to her captivity, her resistance to leaving the room where she had been imprisoned, her inability to adjust to freedom even when that freedom was offered in the gentlest and most supportive circumstances possible. Some doctors interpreted this as evidence that Margaret had been complicit in her own captivity, that she must have done something to deserve or provoke her father's actions,
an interpretation that reveals the victim-blaming attitudes that were even more prevalent in that era than they are today. But other physicians recognized that Margaret's behavior was a psychological adaptation to an impossible situation, a survival mechanism that had allowed her to endure conditions that might otherwise have driven her to suicide or complete mental breakdown. By accepting the reality of her imprisonment, by constructing an internal narrative in which the imprisonment was necessary or justified or temporary, by forming some kind of emotional attachment to her captor, since he was the only human contact she had, Margaret had found a way to preserve some core sense of self through years that would have destroyed many people completely. The fact that these adaptations made it difficult for her to leave captivity when the opportunity finally arose was not evidence of complicity or weakness, but rather a testament to the profound and lasting damage that prolonged trauma inflicts on the human psyche. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery of the crimes at the Thornwell house were necessarily limited by the fact that the primary perpetrator was dead, but they nonetheless served important functions in documenting what had occurred and establishing a historical record that would prevent the events from being forgotten or minimized. A coroner's inquest was held to formally determine the causes of death for Catherine and Elizabeth Thornwell, with testimony from Dr. Morrison, Sheriff Whitaker, Samuel Fletcher, and others who had been involved in the investigation. The inquest concluded that Catherine had been murdered by Nathaniel, though the exact means of her death could not be determined with certainty, and that Elizabeth had died of pneumonia and malnutrition caused by the neglect and abuse she had suffered at Nathaniel's hands. The inquest also examined the question of whether anyone else bore responsibility for what had happened, whether there were individuals who had known or should have known about the situation and failed to act. This portion of the proceedings was particularly painful for those who had to testify about their suspicions and concerns over the years, their failed attempts to investigate, their decisions not to press harder when they encountered resistance from Nathaniel. Sheriff Whitaker testified candidly about his own failures, about his dismissal of Eleanor Bradshaw's concerns, about his prioritization of legal constraints over moral imperatives. Dr. Morrison testified about his visit to treat Elizabeth, about the warning signs he had observed, about his decision not to report his concerns to authorities because he felt he lacked sufficient evidence to justify such a report. The inquest ultimately concluded that while these individuals had made errors in judgment and perhaps had done more to investigate the Thornwell situation, they had not acted with criminal negligence or malicious intent and therefore borne no legal responsibility for what had occurred. This conclusion was legally sound but morally unsatisfying, as it seemed to let everyone off the hook except the one person who could no longer be held accountable. Some community members felt that this was unjust, that those who had the power to investigate and failed to do so should face some consequences for their failures. Others argued that it was unreasonable to expect people to have violated the law or exceeded their authority, based on nothing more than suspicions and uneasy feelings, that hindsight made everything seem obvious, but that at the time the evidence had been ambiguous and incomplete. The debate over individual versus collective responsibility for preventing abuse and protecting the vulnerable that was sparked by the Thornwell case continues to this day in different forms. We still struggle with questions about when suspicions justify intervention, about how much evidence is required before action can be taken, about where the line lies between appropriate concern and invasive meddling, about who bears responsibility when systems fail and vulnerable people are harmed. The Thornwell case provided no clear answers to these questions, but it did illustrate the real costs of erring too far on the side of caution and non-intervention, the human suffering that results when we prioritize privacy and parental authority over the safety and welfare of those who cannot protect themselves. In the decades following the case, researchers and journalists periodically returned to the story, conducting interviews with surviving participants and witnesses, examining documents and records, attempting to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened, and what lessons could be learned from it. Some of these accounts were sensationalized, focusing on the most lurid details and treating the case as a gothic horror story rather than a human tragedy. Others were more thoughtful and analytical, using the case as a lens through which to examine broader questions about family dynamics, mental illness, social isolation, and the failure of protective systems. One particularly insightful analysis, published in a medical journal in the 1920s, examined the question of why Nathaniel Thornwell's mental illness had manifested in the specific form it did, why his delusions had centered on religious themes and on the supposed need to isolate and protect his daughters. The argument was made that Nathaniel's pathology reflected the intersection of individual psychology with cultural narratives about gender, religion, and family that were prevalent in his time and social context. The Victorian era's emphasis on female purity and vulnerability, the religious movements that emphasized personal holiness and separation from worldly corruption, the patriarchal family structure that gave fathers almost absolute authority over wives and children, all of these cultural factors provided a framework within which Nathaniel's disturbed mind could construct delusions that seemed, at least to him, to be reasonable and righteous rather than mad and monstrous. This analysis suggested that preventing future cases like the Thornwell case required not just better systems for detecting and responding to abuse, but also critical examination of the cultural narratives and social structures that could enable and legitimize such abuse. It pointed to the need for cultural change alongside legal and institutional reform, for challenging ideas about family privacy and parental authority that could be used to shield abusers, for questioning religious teachings that emphasized obedience and submission over personal autonomy and well-being, for creating alternative narratives about gender and family that did not position women and children as passive dependents requiring male protection and control.
The physical space where the Thornwell tragedy unfolded continued to exert a strange pull on the imagination of those who knew its history, even as the original structure was demolished and replaced, and the property was absorbed into the expanding boundaries of what eventually became a small but growing town, rather than an isolated mountain settlement. The land itself seemed to carry the weight of what had happened there, and successive owners reported experiencing a profound unease that they could not entirely attribute to knowledge of the property's history. Some claimed to hear sounds at night that had no obvious source, footsteps on stairs that no longer existed, the creak of doors opening and closing in empty rooms. Others spoke of dreams that plagued them during their time in the house, dreams of being trapped in small spaces, of scratching at doors that would not open, of voices calling out for help that never came. Skeptics dismissed these reports as the predictable effects of suggestion and imagination, the human mind's tendency to find patterns and significance in random sensory data when primed by knowledge of tragic events. But others wondered if perhaps there was something more at work, some residual imprint left by intense suffering and trauma that persisted even after the physical structures that contained that suffering had been torn down and replaced. The question of whether places themselves could somehow retain memories of the events that occurred within them was debated by early paranormal researchers who took an interest in the Thornwell case, though their investigations produced no definitive conclusions and were generally dismissed by mainstream scientists as pseudoscientific nonsense. What was undeniable, regardless of one's beliefs about the supernatural, was that the Thornwell case had a lasting psychological impact on the community where it occurred. For years afterward, parents in the area would invoke the Thornwell name as a cautionary tale when warning their children about the importance of maintaining connections with neighbors and community, about the dangers of allowing families to become too isolated, about the need to speak up when something seemed wrong. Teachers used the case as a starting point for discussions about civic responsibility and the obligations individuals have to look out for one another. Ministers preached sermons that referenced the case, though they differed dramatically in their interpretations of what lessons should be drawn from it, some emphasizing the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of balancing faith with reason and compassion, others arguing that Nathaniel's actions represented a perversion of true Christianity rather than any genuine religious motivation. The case also became part of the folklore of the region, transformed through repeated tellings into something that blended historical fact with embellishment and invention. In these folk versions, Margaret Thornwell sometimes became a kind of ghost who haunted the site of her imprisonment, other times a symbol of innocent suffering, occasionally even a figure of redemption who had somehow found peace despite everything she had endured. The details of the actual events became less important than the symbolic meaning assigned to them, the story serving various purposes for different tellers and audiences, sometimes as entertainment, sometimes as moral instruction, sometimes as a way of processing collective anxiety about what darkness might lurk behind the closed doors of seemingly ordinary homes. For the mental health professionals who encountered the case in their training and practice, Margaret Thornwell's story became a canonical example of the devastating effects of prolonged isolation and abuse. Her case was cited in textbooks and lectures, analyzed in clinical discussions, used to illustrate theories about trauma, attachment, and the development of personality. As the field of psychology developed and refined its understanding of these phenomena throughout the 20th century, Margaret's case was repeatedly revisited and reinterpreted through new theoretical frameworks, each generation of researchers finding in her story confirmation of their own models and hypotheses about human psychology and its vulnerabilities. Modern trauma specialists who have examined historical records of the Thornwell case
have noted how closely Margaret's symptoms align with what we now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a diagnosis that was not formalized until the late 20th century, but which describes a constellation of symptoms that result from prolonged exposure to traumatic situations from which escape is not possible. Margaret's dissociation, her difficulty forming coherent narratives about her experiences, her hypervigilance and anxiety, her profound difficulties with trust and attachment, her somatic symptoms, and her regression to childlike behaviors, all of these would be recognized today as classic presentations of complex trauma. What is remarkable, these modern analysts note, is how well some of the interventions provided by Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Hendricks, despite their lack of formal training in trauma treatment, align with what contemporary research suggests are effective approaches: the provision of safety and stability, the establishment of predictable routines, the patient building of trust without pressure to discuss traumatic memories before the survivor is ready. The question of what might have been different if Margaret had received more sophisticated mental health treatment, if she had lived in an era when trauma therapy was more developed and effective interventions were available, is one that clinicians sometimes discuss when considering her case. Some argue that with proper treatment, she might have been able to recover more of her functioning, to reclaim more of her identity and her capacity for relationships and engagement with the world. Others suggest that the damage inflicted by so many years of isolation during critical developmental periods might have been too severe for any intervention to fully address, that Margaret might have reached approximately the same level of functioning regardless of what treatment was provided. This debate touches on fundamental questions about human resilience and plasticity, about whether there are experiences so damaging that they place individuals beyond the reach of healing, or whether with the right support and intervention, every person retains some capacity for recovery and growth. The feminist movement of the 20th century found in the Thornwell case a powerful illustration of the dangers of patriarchal family structures that granted men absolute authority over women and children with minimal oversight or accountability. Feminist scholars analyze the case as an extreme example of patterns that existed in less dramatic forms in countless families: the control and isolation of women, the use of religious and moral rhetoric to justify that control, the cultural assumptions that fathers knew what was best for their daughters and had the right to impose their will on them, regardless of the daughter's own desires or well-being. They pointed out that while Nathaniel Thornwell's actions were unusually extreme, the beliefs that motivated those actions were disturbingly mainstream for his time, that many men believed they had a divinely granted authority to control every aspect of their wives' and daughters' lives, and that social institutions generally supported rather than challenged that authority. This feminist analysis was not without its critics, who argued that it oversimplified the case and ignored the role of Nathaniel's clear mental illness in driving his behavior. These critics suggested that using the Thornwell case to critique normal patriarchal family structures was like using a case of someone who murdered their neighbor to argue against homeownership, an illegitimate leap from an extreme aberration to a condemnation of an entire social system. But feminist scholars responded that the distinction between Nathaniel's extreme behavior and more ordinary forms of patriarchal control was one of degree rather than kind, that the same attitudes and assumptions that led Nathaniel to lock his daughter in a room led other fathers to control their daughters' educations, their social contacts, their choices of marriage partners, their access to economic resources and independence. The fact that most fathers did not take these impulses to murderous extremes did not mean that the underlying power dynamics were benign or acceptable. The legal reforms that emerged in part from the Thornwell case and similar cases gradually expanded the authority of the state to intervene in family situations where children or dependent adults appeared to be at risk. Mandatory reporting laws were enacted that required teachers, doctors, and other professionals to report suspected abuse or neglect to authorities. Child welfare agencies were given broader powers to investigate such reports and to remove children from dangerous situations. Courts became more willing to terminate parental rights in cases of severe abuse or neglect. These reforms undoubtedly prevented many tragedies and saved many lives, but they also created new problems and controversies, as expanded state power was sometimes used inappropriately or discriminatorily, targeting poor families and families of color for intervention while overlooking abuse in more privileged households, removing children from homes based on cultural misunderstandings rather than actual danger, creating a foster care system that itself became the site of abuse and trauma for many children.
The complexity of these issues, the reality that efforts to protect the vulnerable can themselves become sources of harm when implemented poorly or with insufficient oversight, means that the lessons of the Thornwell case remain relevant and contested more than a century after the events occurred. We have not solved the fundamental problem that the case illuminated, have not found a perfect balance between respecting family autonomy and protecting those who cannot protect themselves.
have not created systems that reliably identify and respond to abuse, without also creating opportunities for overreach and injustice. What we have done, at best, is become more aware of the problem and more willing to grapple with its complexities, rather than pretending that simple solutions exist. The story of Margaret Thornwell also raises profound questions about justice and accountability that extend beyond the legal realm into moral and philosophical territory. Nathaniel's death before his crimes were discovered meant that he never faced trial, never had to answer in a court of law for what he had done, never experienced any earthly punishment for the suffering he inflicted. For some people, particularly those with strong religious convictions, this absence of earthly justice was acceptable, because they believed that Nathaniel would face divine judgment that would be far more comprehensive and severe than anything a human court could impose. But for others, particularly those without such beliefs, or those who felt that justice required public accountability and not just private spiritual reckoning, the fact that Nathaniel escaped earthly consequences felt like a fundamental failure, an incompleteness in the moral arc of the story that could never be satisfactorily resolved. There is also the question of what justice for Margaret herself would have looked like, beyond the basic provision of safety and care that she received after her rescue. She could not be restored to the life she would have had if the abuse had never occurred, could not reclaim the years that had been stolen from her, could not undo the damage that had been done to her mind and body and spirit. The care provided by Mrs. Hendricks was generous and compassionate, but it was also inadequate compensation for what Margaret had lost. The burial next to her mother and sister provided symbolic closure, but it came only after she had lived out what remained of her damaged life in a state of permanent psychological exile from normalcy and connection. What would true justice have required? What could possibly have made things right for someone who had suffered what she had suffered? These questions become even more complex when we consider the ways in which Margaret's own agency and personhood were compromised by her trauma. The woman who was rescued from that locked room was not the same person who had been locked in it years earlier. The Margaret who had existed before the imprisonment, the young woman with whatever thoughts and dreams and possibilities she might have possessed, had been effectively killed by her father's actions, even though her body remained alive. The Margaret who survived was a different person, shaped entirely by her captivity, unable to access or articulate whatever inner life the earlier Margaret might have had. In a very real sense, Nathaniel had succeeded in his delusional project of remaking his daughter according to his own vision, though what he created was not the spiritually pure being he imagined, but rather a broken shell that could never be made whole again. The limits of empathy and understanding when confronting suffering of this magnitude are themselves significant. We can read about what happened to Margaret Thornwell, can try to imagine what those years in that locked room must have been like, can feel horror and pity and outrage at her fate, but we cannot truly understand what she experienced, because human language and human imagination are ultimately inadequate to convey the reality of such extreme suffering. The accounts we have of her condition after her rescue describe her symptoms and behaviors, but they cannot capture the subjective experience of living in that damaged mind, of existing in that state of permanent psychological dislocation. Margaret herself could not explain it, could not find words to bridge the gap between her internal reality and the shared reality that others inhabited. She remained fundamentally alone even after she was no longer physically isolated, trapped in an experiential solitude that no amount of compassionate care could fully penetrate.
The question that echoes across the decades since Margaret Thornwell was finally freed from her captivity is perhaps the simplest and most profound one we can ask. How do we ensure that such things do not happen again? The answer, frustratingly but honestly, is that we cannot guarantee prevention of all such tragedies, cannot create systems so perfect and comprehensive that no vulnerable person ever falls through the cracks, cannot eliminate the human capacity for cruelty and delusion that Nathaniel's actions possible. What we can do, what the Thornwell case demands that we do, is maintain constant vigilance, continue to refine and improve our protective systems, challenge cultural narratives that enable abuse, and most importantly, refuse to look away when our instincts tell us that something is wrong, even when we lack definitive proof. The legacy of Eleanor Bradshaw, the school teacher who raised concerns that were initially dismissed, reminds us that ordinary people acting on moral intuition and refusing to accept convenient explanations can make a difference even when systems and authorities fail. Her vindication came too late to save the Thornwell women, but her example inspired others to trust their instincts and to persist in demanding investigation and action when they suspected abuse or neglect. In the years following the case, several other situations of family abuse and imprisonment were discovered in the region, brought to light by neighbors or teachers or doctors who remembered the Thornwell case and refused to dismiss their concerns as none of their business. The story of Mrs. Hendricks, who opened her home to Margaret and provided years of patient, compassionate care, expecting nothing in return, offers a different but equally important lesson about the power of individual acts of kindness and commitment to partially redeem even the most terrible situations. Mrs. Hendricks could not undo what had been done to Margaret, could not restore what had been taken from her, but she could and did provide a space of safety and dignity for the remainder of Margaret's life. In doing so, she demonstrated that even when justice is impossible and healing is incomplete, human connection and compassion still matter, still make a difference in the lived experience of those who suffer. The medical professionals who studied Margaret's case and worked to understand the psychological mechanisms of trauma and survival contributed to a body of knowledge that has helped countless people in the decades since. The understanding that extreme suffering can fundamentally alter personality and perception, that trauma is not just an event, but a lasting condition that affects every aspect of functioning, that recovery requires not just the removal of the traumatic situation, but sustained support and the gradual rebuilding of a sense of safety and trust. All of these insights that seem obvious now were not well understood in the 19th century. Margaret's suffering was not redeemed by becoming a case study, but at least it was not entirely meaningless. At least it contributed to knowledge that might prevent or reduce future suffering. For those of us who encounter this story more than a century after its occurrence, who live in a world that is in many ways very different from the one the Thornwell family inhabited, but which still contains the same fundamental human capacities for both cruelty and compassion, the case offers several specific challenges. First, it challenges us to examine our own assumptions about family privacy and the limits of community responsibility, to consider whether we are too quick to dismiss signs of trouble as none of our concern, too willing to accept surface explanations when deeper investigation might reveal hidden suffering. Second, it challenges us to support and strengthen the institutions and systems that exist to protect the vulnerable, recognizing that while these systems are imperfect and sometimes prone to overreach, they represent our collective attempt to prevent tragedies like the Thornwell case from occurring in isolation and silence. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the case challenges us to maintain awareness that suffering of this magnitude is not merely a historical phenomenon, that abuse and imprisonment and exploitation continue to occur in forms both similar to and different from what happened in that Kentucky house in the late 19th century. Human trafficking, domestic servitude, severe mental and physical abuse within families, prolonged isolation of elderly or disabled individuals, all of these represent contemporary versions of the same fundamental violation of human dignity that Nathaniel Thornwell perpetrated against his wife and daughters. The specific circumstances change, the methods of control and concealment evolve,
but the underlying dynamics of power, isolation, and the exploitation of vulnerability remain remarkably consistent across time and cultures. The final words of this account must belong not to the perpetrator, not to the systems that failed, not even to those who eventually helped, but to the victims themselves, to Catherine and Elizabeth and Margaret Thornwell, 3 women whose lives were stolen from them by a man who claimed to be protecting them, who endured suffering that we can document but never fully comprehend, who died without ever receiving anything approaching adequate justice or compensation for what they had lost. We remember them not as abstract symbols or case studies, but as human beings who deserved better than they received, who should have been protected but were not, whose suffering demands acknowledgement, and whose memory obligates us to do better in our own time for those who depend on us for protection and care. The bolted door that Samuel Fletcher opened on that spring day in 1893 revealed horrors that the community would rather not have known about, truths that were easier to avoid than to confront. But the opening of that door also represents a necessary confrontation with uncomfortable reality, a refusal to allow suffering to remain hidden and unacknowledged, simply because acknowledging it is difficult and disturbing. Every generation faces the choice of whether to open such doors or to leave them closed, whether to investigate the silence behind them or to accept reassuring explanations that allow us to avoid uncomfortable truths. The Thornwell case reminds us that choosing comfort over truth, choosing privacy over protection, choosing to look away rather than to investigate, always carries costs that are borne not by those who make that choice, but by the vulnerable individuals whose suffering continues in darkness while we maintain our willful ignorance of it. No one should be allowed to suffer as the Thornwell women suffered. No door should remain closed for 40 years while horror unfolds behind it. No community should prioritize privacy and propriety over the protection of the vulnerable. These are the lessons written in the sad history of that house in Kentucky, lessons that we forget at our peril, and at the peril of those who depend on us to remember.